My concern is over censorship and digital freedom, and when concepts like using democracy as a pretext for regime change, so to speak, comes home and is used as part of a pretext for doing, say, the regime change of a U.S. president on democracy grounds, and using the same toolkit that is done in, for example, a regime change context where control over media is absolutely essential, because what you are doing in a regime change operation is you are operationalizing huge masses of a indigenous or domestic population in order to create a ground-up overthrow of a sitting government. And in order to do that, you need to control the media infrastructure. You need to control the narratives that people believe, because you need them to believe that their government is evil or illegitimate or tyrannical in order for them to overthrow that government. So in that context, when there's a democracy threat, it creates the predicate for controlling the media in that territory. And there are various ways that the U.S. State Department, various assets that can be deployed on the media side in the foreign context. What was new is that in 2016, this began coming home. This foreign to domestic switcheroo was done in the media context through several mechanisms: the creation and the government funding of these censorship professional groups that were essentially cutouts of the U.S. State Department, of the U.S. Defense Department, or DHS. The so-called threat to democracy from social media fueling populism was a common slogan by which all the different stakeholders in the foreign policy establishment could band together to say that there's a common threat we all face. Whether we're Democrats associated with the National Democratic Institute or Republicans associated with foreign policy wings like the International Republican Institute, we're not threatened by, say, liberalism or conservatism, because that's a partisan thing. But if we're commonly threatened by democracy, we can use that as our common rallying point for us all to pour those resources in together. What happened was, though, is they needed to create this sort of new definition of democracy to justify censoring in the name of democracy. And essentially how they did that was by defining democracy as not being a consensus.
And we had to decide what to do. And in that moment, with limited information, Twitter made a mistake. Under the distribution of hacked material policy, the company decided to prevent links to the New York Post stories about the laptop from being shared across the service.
Representative James Comer responded to Roth's claim that it was a mistake.
In reality, the Twitter executives were hostile towards conservatives and biased towards anyone who opposed their points of view. For example, Mr. Roth, did you write this tweet?
I regret the language that I used in some of my former tweets, but yes, I did post that.
And I'll read the tweet so it's in the record. Yes, that person in the pink hat is clearly a bigger threat to your brand of feminism than actual Nazis in the White House. Mr. Roth, do you think all conservatives are Nazis?
Certainly not, sir.
One of the reasons Republicans were concerned about the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story is because they say it could have changed the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Representative Pat Fallon pointed out alleged political bias, as he said 98% of Twitter employees donated to Democratic candidates or causes in the 2020 election cycle.
The Media Research Center polled Democratic voters in 2020 swing states and found that 17% would have changed their vote if they had known the contents and evidence of the New York Post story. President Trump lost key states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin, by collectively just over 100,000 votes. And if this is accurate, this poll, 3.2 million votes could have swung. And he only needed a teeny fraction of those 3.2 million. That decision almost certainly changed the result of the 2020 presidential election.
Representative Jasmine Crockett added this.
MAGA Republicans can't let go. That should be the name of this hearing. I'm glad that seemingly we have now accepted that President Joe Biden won the election, even though now we are blaming President Trump's loss on Twitter. Can we finally let it go? This is why Democrats are reinforcing that in this hearing we should be talking about
my God.
democracy. That's the real threat, not an old article that seemingly couldn't reach the viewership it sought through
Russia's invasion of Ukraine and instead increased Russian oil imports. Plus, they're taking more aggressive actions towards Taiwan. And now they're flying spy balloons over the United States. These are not friendly actions or actions of a country that wants peace. And yes, the CCP claimed it was a weather balloon and wasn't spying. But here's Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder.
I can assure you this was not for civilian purposes. That is, we are 100% clear about that. Based on what we know and have observed about this balloon, it is a surveillance balloon. It was an intelligence collection capability.
China, meanwhile, still maintaining it was a civilian balloon that had drifted off course and that the U.S., quote, overreacted in shooting it down. The Chinese regime going so far as to threaten to respond in kind. As for what that might look like going forward and how best we should respond, we have a full lineup of experts here tonight to help break it down. Joining us now to discuss the increasing provocation we see from China is Gordon Chang. Gordon is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. Gordon, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiffany.
On Twitter, you said that both Canada and the United States military failed to defend their airspace regarding the Chinese spy balloon. Can you expand on that?
Simple. January 28th, this balloon entered the U.S. Air Defense Identification Zone, and it wasn't shot down until Saturday. It had 8 days transversing the United States and Canada, and along the way, it was surveilling extremely sensitive military sites. So I think that it's apparent that we didn't defend ourselves.
And Gordon, so what should America's first response should have been?
First response would have been to shoot it down as soon as it crossed into territorial U.S. airspace, and that would be by the Aleutians, and that would have been on January 28th. This balloon was maneuverable, and clearly the Chinese were actually directing its path.
And despite that, China is still saying it's a weather balloon, right? But we're getting conflicting reports out of our own Defense Department. At the beginning saying, oh, it's not hostile, it's just a balloon, and then saying, but it is different from previous ones. So why all these different messages coming out?
Well, first of all, China lies. So clearly that's the reason why they're telling us it's just a weather balloon. But even if it were just a weather balloon, Tiffany, drifting into the United States, we have every right to shoot it down. Because that's our territorial airspace. That's exactly what the Chinese would do. As a matter of fact, the Chinese have a propaganda film from a couple of years ago about shooting down a foreign balloon entering Chinese airspace. So whatever it was, we had the right to do it, and the Chinese should stop lying about this.
And so speaking of shooting the balloon down, the Biden administration did finally shoot it down, but not before the balloon had flown thousands of miles over the United States. So what message does that send to China?
Well, first of all, China got a very good look to see how we deal with intrusions, but it shows that there was confusion and disarray in the Pentagon and also probably in the Biden administration itself. But depending on when the president first heard about it, but there are reports that he did not hear about it until the fourth day of this intrusion, which would indicate that the military is not prepared, at least mentally, to deal with China. We have a lot of capabilities, but they mean nothing if we don't use them. And for those 4 days, the president, who's the commander-in-chief, was not briefed about this. If that is indeed the case, and the president, I assume, is telling the truth, then we've got a real problem in the Pentagon. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but that is something that we cannot rule out. And if indeed that is the case, it means that there is intense infighting at the top of the Communist Party and that Xi Jinping is not as strong as everyone thinks him to be. The one thing about the Chinese regime, Tiffany, is that it is opaque. We know less about it than we did, for instance, 3 or 4 years ago, which means that at this point, we can't rule out options of alternative explanations.
And Gordon, speaking of politics, turning now to the U.S. side, what are your thoughts on how President Biden addressed the issue of China, or didn't, in his State of the Union speech?
Well, he certainly hurried over China, and he did not make a direct reference to the balloon. He just mentioned we'll defend our sovereignty. I think that was certainly insufficient given the nature of this provocation and also how close it was to the State of the Union address. So I don't give him high marks for doing that. He had an opportunity to say something which is critical and which I believe he must say. And that is, the Chinese are preparing for war. This was a warning to us, and we must prepare for war as well. We've got to match the Chinese mobilization. I know that most people will think that's too drastic, but we Americans are very good at being oblivious as to what our enemies are saying. And we did not pay attention to Osama bin Laden until one day he killed 2,977 Americans.
Paul Gordon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, it turned out to be a Chinese spy balloon, and we were only told about it because people saw it floating in the sky. On top of that, reports have come out claiming that 3 Chinese balloons entered U.S. airspace during the Trump years. However, Trump and other top officials in his administration have said that if true, they were never informed and had no idea. Joining us to discuss all things Chinese spy balloon is former U.S. Congressman and chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes. Devin is now the CEO of Trump's Truth Social. Devin, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you here again.
Great to be with you, as always.
So I want to zoom in on this balloon episode. As the former chair of the House Intelligence Committee, were you ever told about these 3 Chinese balloons during the Trump years? And if not, why do you think you weren't told about them? Why are we finding out about them now?
Well, I'm not sure we even have all the facts about this at all. So I guess the quick answer is no, I was not. But also, I'm not even sure what they're referring to. We've only heard some vague answers out of one of the military commanders. And none of us were briefed on the Intelligence Committee. In fact, I've heard from former Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, who, if anybody, he would have been briefed. And this clearly wouldn't have been hid from Congress. So my guess is that it didn't happen. And whatever they're talking about, they probably owe Congress a better explanation at this point, and the American public.
Devin, expanding on that, it seems former CIA Director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has also said he had never heard about the spy balloons while in office, and he's calling the allegations about withholding information from Trump by military generals, quote, deeply dangerous. Do you think that military generals withheld information from Trump, or is this allegation a deflection by the Biden administration?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration is getting themselves in deeper. So clearly, if anyone in the military or the intelligence agency was withholding any information from the Trump administration, I agree with Secretary Pompeo, that would be a deep, dark, very dangerous place for the United States of America. But I just believe that they're making this up, really. So they're probably taking something that has maybe an ounce of truth, like maybe that, and I'm just speculating here, that maybe they caught something where the Chinese were experimenting, or they thought someone was experimenting. But the idea that this would have flown into U.S. airspace and we're just now finding about it later, I find that very, very hard to believe.
And one of the roles of the president is commander-in-chief, and it is his job to make decisions about military action. So what does it tell us if, and that's a big if, generals are withholding information from Trump when he was president?
Well, look, I think that would be a very dangerous place to go, but we have seen that, so troubling. So you can't rule it out entirely, although I think it's highly unlikely that the military and intelligence withheld things. But we have seen it in the Department of Justice and the FBI, where there was tremendous damage being done, tremendous lies being told by the DOJ and the FBI. For example, when it came to the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, that was coined as Russian disinformation, when in fact the leadership and everyone knew that that wasn't true. So there was where they took something that was not true, but on behalf of the Democratic Party acted like it was true and got Twitter, Facebook, and other social media sites to censor that story. They even got some 51 former high-ranking military intelligence professionals to say that it was in fact Russian disinformation, when they all had to know that Hunter Biden laptop was real, and now we know it's real because Hunter Biden's own lawyers have admitted that it's real.
And Devin, going back to the balloon, what are Trump's thoughts on that? Has he said anything about it to you?
Well, the only thing that he said it very publicly on Truth Social, and that was the very first day when this broke out in the news. President President Trump put in very bold print on Truth Social, shoot down the balloon. And of course it took, 4 or 5 more days for the United States government to do what should have been done as soon as that crossed into the big open skies of Montana.
And we're hearing that Congress is planning to investigate the Chinese spy balloon and also look at the possibility that Trump wasn't briefed by his generals about these occurrences. And you led the Intelligence Committee. So what do you think Congress will uncover, and what, if anything, can they do about it?
Well, I think what they're going to uncover, if they can get their hands on the communications and the emails, is that this was a false and phony narrative meant to deflect in order to protect Biden. And in fact, I think if it wouldn't have been for the former retired reporter and the guy that had a Cessna that was into astronomy in Montana, had they not noticed that and then actually took some pictures of it, I think that the Biden administration was just going to let this balloon go on through and never going to say a damn thing, if you can believe that or not. And I think that ultimately what they were doing is they were desperate for a deflection, a new narrative, and that's why they created what they created.
And Devin, you mentioned how Trump said to shoot it down immediately, but in your opinion, why didn't Biden shoot the Chinese balloon down immediately?
Look, I think it's what I just said. I think they thought that this wasn't going to be discovered. When it was, then they didn't know what to do. Then they came out with this fake story. Oh, there were 3 balloons during the Trump administration. And of course, that was quickly proven as not true. And then they were going to look so pathetically weak, letting a known foreign adversary like China, whose goal is world domination, to let this balloon go over the entire United States of America, over our military bases, and then float off out to the Atlantic. I don't know where I think they would have never shot it down.
Wow. Devin Nunes, thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.
CNN called his message one of unadulterated optimism, even in the face of open hostility. While the former chief speechwriter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo rated his speech a D and said, quote, hardly ever has a president said less in more than an hour of speaking than Joe Biden did tonight. Joining us to discuss Biden's State of the Union address and the GOP's rebuttal is Epoch Times contributor and constitutional attorney Jenna Ellis. Jenna also served as a senior advisor and counsel to President Trump. Jenna, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you again.
Great to see you too.
So overall, what was your impression of President Biden's speech and the policies he touched on?
Well, of course, from the Republican perspective, it was a complete disaster, and there are a lot of reasons, objective reasons, that the Republicans are right. But from the Democrats' perspective, their goal here was to position Biden as ready and able to be the leader and the candidate to launch his 2024 campaign. And that goal, even for their side, was an utter failure because Joe Biden stumbled over his words. He got angry. He showed some classic signs of dementia and some mental failings. And he also failed very certainly to provide any sort of comprehensive unity with the whole audience just erupting at times with this kind of emotional reaction and anger toward the outright misrepresentations that his speech contained.
And Jenna, on the flip side, what did you think about the GOP rebuttal given by Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders?
Well, I love Sarah Sanders, and I think she's an excellent governor, and I know her personally through my work for President Trump. So I do have some bias there, but just from her presentation, I thought it was very measured. It was respectful. It contained a lot of true, genuine patriotism and optimism that you didn't see in Biden's rhetoric. And it also contained some forward-looking analysis of the future of America and really a contrast between what the Republican Party stands for, which is normalcy, legitimacy, and contrasting that from the Democrat position, which in her word was crazy.
And during Biden's speech, going back to that, Biden said several things that might be considered stretching the truth. One big one was that Republicans wanted to sunset Social Security and Medicare. But the Republicans called him out during his address, which is something we also saw happen under President Trump with the Democrats. So what are your thoughts on this approach? Is it appropriate to call out any president during a State of the Union? Your thoughts?
Well, the State of the Union has really become unmoored from its constitutional intent. Of course, this is a required address that the Constitution provides for, but really it's become in the modern era more of a PR speech that is an address to the nation, not information given to Congress. And so if you're looking at it from the modern medium, which is really just a television presentation, then I do think it is appropriate for the other side to be able to call out and fact check, or at least express an opinion in real time. What I thought was remarkable about last night that I don't recall ever seeing in a State of the Union address is for the opposition party in the Speaker of the House's position, as Kevin McCarthy was last night. So, of course, on camera with the president actually mouthing words like "that's not true" or "I disagree" in real time as the president speaking. And I thought that was actually very effective for McCarthy to do that.
And going back to earlier with Biden's speech being labeled a test run for his reelection campaign, if that's true, what did his test run tell you about Biden's campaign?
The DNC absolutely needs a new candidate. And I don't think that anyone, including the Democrats, genuinely have confidence. And certainly the approval polls suggest that the American people really don't either. But the problem for the Democrats is that they really don't have that deep of a bench. Certainly Kamala Harris has been an utter failure, and she is not well liked at all. And there's not really any other up-and-comers that the Democrat Party can really proffer, and they do have an incumbent. So they have a very difficult situation ahead of them with Joe Biden not yet having announced a re-election campaign, but reports are that he is poised to do that soon, and I think that the Democrats are facing a very difficult challenge.
And Jenna, you mentioned earlier how in the rebuttal, Governor Sanders was calling, this difference between normal or crazy, and that's between high taxes or money in your pocket, high gas prices and empty grocery shelves, or American prosperity, freedom, or government control. With all of these different things, do you think that's a fair depiction of both sides and what's happened under Democratic leadership?
Absolutely. And I think the winning message for Republicans headed into 2024, regardless of who gets the nomination, has to be that Republicans stand for normal. Make America normal again, rather than the crazy leftists. If you look at the entire transgender movement, if you look at what Democrats are actually suggesting with partial birth or even after birth abortion, I mean, some of these policies, just in terms of reality, are not only unconstitutional, but they're also nonsensical, and they're also policies that simply aren't supported by the powers that the Constitution actually provides for the agents and the elected officers that the Democrats are proffering. So just looking at the content of Biden's speech and the Democrats' overall message, they are outcome-driven, and they don't care about limited power. It is a huge contrast, and so I think that that is a very apt description.
Last night, the entire neighborhood, the lights went out in my apartment, and I looked outside, street lights are on, and I looked again. Everything was black, street lights, traffic lights, the entire neighborhood around my building was black, lights out. First thing I thought about is, did somebody go shoot up some transformers like they did in Washington and Oregon? And somebody else tried to do that stuff. They got arrested.